Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here today with us at the Abuظbي International Book Fair. This session is about the book, Every Day is Extra, a revealing memoir by former U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry. Please join me in welcoming Mr. John Kerry and His Excellency Dr. Zaki Nusseibeh. Thank you.
Now we shake hands. Your Excellency, shall we just shake hands first?
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. Mr. Secretary, let me first say what a great honor it is to welcome you here with us in the United Arab Emirates. You have been a patriot working in your country as a soldier, as a diplomat, as a senator, as a secretary of state, as a presidential candidate, perhaps you still are. So what amazing insights you bring to our public here today. Your book, Every Day is Extra, that we are celebrating today, has been acclaimed as a major contribution to the social and political history of our century. You yourself explained the title of your book by relating it to your Vietnam experience, and you say, it is not just a statement of fact, it's an attitude about life. It is the recognition of a gift and a mystery. It is a philosophy lived by people who could have died on any given day, but didn't when far too many good men did. So you describe how this war shaped your life and your career from the very beginning. You started in Vietnam as a hero, much decorated. Then you became an anti-war activist. You went back to Vietnam to sign your peace agreement with your former enemies. So let me start by asking, how have these experiences prepared you for your role in public life?
Okay. Can all of you hear? Can you hear all right? Well, first of all, thank you very much for the privilege of being here. Thank you, Zaki, for your welcome. And it's a great pleasure for me to be able to be here. I know this is a long way from a tent in the 1970s, which I gather was the first book fair, and it's only gone like this since, which is a reflection of the UAE and a reflection of Abu Dhabi and your leadership. So it's a great honor for me to be able to be here, to be with you today. This book is a book that I wanted to, first of all, make sure was accurate, truthful, honest, and it's not meant to be a political treatise. It's meant to be the chronicle of a journey of one young American, once upon a time young, who learned along the way and who went through experiences that I believe are a chronicle of the journey of the United States of America from the end of World War II until today. That's what the book is about. And Every Day is Extra is a reflection of an attitude that the men who served with me in the war in Vietnam came back with because we were the lucky ones. If you've been in war, you know that any bullet, any bomb, any mortar, any IED, anything could be for anybody at any moment in time. And when I left country, I was a skipper of a gunboat in the Mekong Delta. And sometimes we went up rivers which were not wider than this room, I promise you. And you'd have mangrove along the sides of the river, and you simply waited to be ambushed. And we were constantly being ambushed. when I left country, my boat probably had about 160 holes in it. 3 of them were this far above my head. So you gain a respect for the randomness of not just war, but of life. And we're living in a particularly complicated time right now. Look at Sri Lanka. You go to church Easter Sunday, and you think you'll come back and celebrate a good lunch with your family, and you're dead. I don't have to talk to any of you about the randomness of extremist violence that we have seen over the course of the last 25 or 30 years. So what I drew from that experience is a sense of responsibility, that if you are in a position of service and it happens to involve war, and you're lucky enough to live, you also bear a responsibility. And the responsibility is to the people who didn't make it back, to try to make certain that their lives were not lost in vain. And that means committing yourself to a public purpose. So my life has been very much in the public sector. I protested the war. When I came back, I protested publicly against the war in Vietnam. I led the veterans against the war on a famous march to Washington. We camped overnight for 5 days right below the Capitol to speak to Congress and to speak to the American people. Why? Because the war was based on lies. The American people were lied to about the war in Vietnam, and it was divorced from reality, from the reality of history, the experience of the French, the reality of a war of liberation, a civil war. But we involved ourselves in it and made it part of the great game at that period of time with Russia, China, the Soviet Union, China, and the war against communism. And people had a theory that somehow America had to stop communism in Vietnam or it was going to take over the whole region. Of course that wasn't true. And ultimately, what we chose to do was divorced from history, divorced from reality. We also learned in the Pentagon Papers that governments can lie to their people, and it takes the people to hold the government accountable. So I'm very proud of what we did, Zaki. I think it was controversial. It even remained controversial when I ran for president of the United States. People who were angry at me because I had opposed the war remained angry and lied about my record and lied about me. Now we see lies every day. The American media has been dominated by this administration's willingness to lie on any given day. Thousands of lies. And they're all documented. So I'm not here in another country to tell you something that you don't already know and read about. It's a very difficult time with the new social media, with the internet, with the ability of a lie to move around the world in just like that. Push a button, the lie goes out, it can go all around the world. And it is much harder in today's world for leaders to be able to persuade their people of basic facts. What are the facts? We're actually still having an argument in the United States in some places over the facts about climate change. It's crazy, it's absurd, because science is science, and science tells us what's happening. So the answer to your question is, my book is an attempt to show the journey of America from the 1960s the cultural revolution we experienced with rock and roll, protest, the women's movement, the environment movement, the peace movement, the efforts to civil rights movement, to bring all of our citizens into fair administration of the rule of law, so people who weren't allowed to vote could actually vote. We have to fight for all of that. And the book, in the end, is optimistic, as I am optimistic. I believe we can work through this mess. I believe my book is meant to be an affirmation of the ability of people to make democracy work or to make governance work. I was driving over here with your Minister of Culture, and we were talking about how the government works here. Your government is in many ways more in touch with people than sometimes my government is, because of your majlis, because you have leadership that works very hard to reach out and listen to people and respond to them. So governance can take all kinds of shapes and sizes. I'm not a politician who says, you've got to do this, you have to be like this. We have to gain greater respect for governments that are responsible and responsive around the world, as long as they're moving forward in a way that is advancing people. And the book is a story of how you do that in one place, but how it can apply lessons to everywhere else in the world.
Thank you very much, John. In fact, you touched on many subjects I want to come back to later, including your optimism, the issues of the environment, issues of false facts, and the social media. But to go back specifically to your war experience and to bring it closer to our region, how did you specifically read the war in Iraq in 2003 under the Republican administration? And then later, the war in Syria, because you took a position against Obama's not taking any steps in order to enforce his crossing the line. What lessons do we learn from both for our region? Could it have been done in a better way?
Could it ever have been done in a better way? Of course. The war in Iraq was a mistake. I think it's one of the biggest mistakes the United States has ever made in our foreign policy. I opposed going into Iraq except as a matter of last resort. My vote to give the president leverage was a vote that was predicated on his promise to us that the United States would only go to war as a last resort after we had exhausted the UN procedures to get Saddam Hussein to allow us to inspect, and only if we had a coalition of nations that agreed that we needed to go to war. That didn't happen. It was not a war of last resort. It was a war of choice, which was accelerated by the desire just to get it done. And in the process, it alienated massive numbers of people. No one doubted, I never doubted for 1 minute, 1 second, the United States could kick out Saddam Hussein. I never doubted that our military would win in a matter of days. We always knew we had that power. What I worried about is the lack of legitimacy for the war based on whether or not they had weapons of mass destruction and how you manage it afterwards. And it's clear from history that the administration had no idea what they were going to do the day Saddam Hussein disappeared. So Paul Bremer comes in, no experience, without a plan, and they disband the army. The one entity that could have held together cohesion and made sure you didn't have a rise of terrorism, they simply disbanded and sent them home. So you had a huge number of people who suddenly experienced something that history had never been able to achieve. And you know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the exploitation between Shia and Sunni. That is a battle and a struggle that had gone on for 1,200 years, from 682. And Karbala and the desert, when 72 of Hussein's cohorts were killed in the desert in an ambush. And Hussein had his head cut off, and it was taken to Damascus and put on a stake. That is the beginning of a great division in belief within Islam. And for 1,200 years, the Sunni basically ran Iraq. Along comes the administration, they invade, and they turn 1,200 years of history on its ear. So that all of a sudden the Shia are, because they're a majority, but they had never win it at the ballot box. And the result is the rise of extremism, Al-Qaeda, ISIS ultimately, and I think it exacerbated some tensions within this region as a whole. So, in my judgment, the United States once again didn't understand history well enough and didn't understand tribalism well enough and didn't understand the culture well enough. And so we are where we are. I think that Syria was an outgrowth of that in some ways, but it was more than that. Syria was the third or fourth component of the Arab Spring, so-called Arab Spring. So you had Tunisia, a dictator of 30 years is driven out, fight for change. Then you had Tahrir Square in Egypt with the remarkable impact of Google and smartphones and young people. And then you had Syria. Essentially, it was a struggle for the future, for a different future for people. What I've always remarked on to people is it was not religiously driven, it was not extremist driven, it was young people who wanted a different future. And that is certainly what spilled over into Syria. Now, I had met with President Bashar al-Assad 5 or 6 times because we were concerned about the flow of weapons from Iran going into Hezbollah and into Lebanon. And we were trying to work with Assad to see if we could get him to take a smarter position, more futuristic, modern. And he told me that he was ready to make a deal. He wanted a pipeline of oil from Iraq. He wanted modern technology. He wanted airplanes. He wanted airplane parts. He wanted healthcare and business, and he wanted jobs for young people. Tragically, when the uprising took place, which was young people demonstrating for jobs, he didn't listen. He responded to them with violence. And then the parents of those young people came out and demonstrated. And once again, instead of trying to find a way to deal inclusively, he responded again with violence. Bullets this time. People were killed. And that was the beginning of a civil uprising. And unfortunately, it got much more complicated then. You had about 6 wars going on in Syria. You had Sunni Shia, you had Assad against the opposition, but you also had Kurds, and you had violent groups like Al-Qaeda, which became al-Nusra and transformed. And all of these fights were trying to take advantage of the disruption. Assad made the mistake of doing what his father had done 20 years earlier when he killed 20,000 people and crushed the rebellion, and he decided to crush the rebellion, which now, obviously, in hindsight, after the destruction of countless cities, maybe 500,000 people dead, a huge 12 million person diaspora having been created, the country basically destroyed. Kurds hold part of it. He holds part of it with Russia's help. The opposition holds part of it. You have a terrible, terrible scar on the region. I felt in 2012 and 2013, when I became Secretary of State, Assad was particularly weak. Members of his government were defecting. Generals, colonels were defecting. The opposition was quite strong. And I thought if the United States had taken a stronger position then, we might have been able to get to Geneva and have the leverage to negotiate a transition that could have been more peaceful and ultimately reflected a better future for Syria. I was one of the few voices, UN Ambassador Samantha Power agreed with me, a few other people did, but I lost the fight in the administration to argue that we should have taken a stronger position, so the United States held back more, and in the process of holding back more, I think it opened up a vacuum that eventually Russia filled together with the Iranians. So in effect, Iran became stronger, Russia became stronger, the United States basically pulled back, and I think it had a profound negative impact on the perception of the United States within the Gulf as a whole. So to me, that was a critical moment in terms of foreign policy. Now, when we negotiated with Iran, I made every effort possible to reach out to the region. The president had a summit, Camp David. We gave the greatest single military assistance and assurance in history to the Gulf states. We created a Gulf state security arrangement to make it clear to Iran that we were very much here, front and center, and we could be counted on. But regrettably, the red line of chemical weapons and the lack of the bombing that took place gained a life of its own, and it undermined the other components of American policy in the region. So it's very complicated, but the bottom line is I think that the current situation in Syria is a scar on the entire international community and its unwillingness to do what was necessary to make peace in Syria. It's a tragedy of vast proportion, and it will play out in many different ways over the course of the next 5, 10 years. I do not see Russia or Iran or any other country currently putting the money into the rebuilding of Syria that will be necessary. So Syria is effectively almost a failed orphan state at this moment, and it will require major diplomacy, major efforts by people to come together to fix it.
So everything you say, in fact, is showing that we are going through a cyclically very bad period in international politics, a scar on the record of the international community. You write in your book, John, I've told much of this story in these pages for a reason, not to relive a difficult past, but to remember how we changed the course of our country. You add in a different part of your book, I'm an optimist because America has a pretty good 242-year record of turning difficult passages into landmark progress. But then you also say, politics had clearly entered a dark new chapter and has been growing darker ever since. As we view the international order around us, almost collapse, disintegrate around us, the architecture that was set in place after the Second World War, international law. As we see all of this fake news, election, and interference in elections, you mentioned the social media and its influence on what is happening in liberal democracies. Many are suggesting that we are going into a new phase internationally with a new major shift in power balance between the major powers. What is the new world going to look like? If it's, how can we manage the rivalries that come out in a better way?
That's a huge question, but it's a critical question, and I want to answer it very, very directly. We are in a very difficult period, but one of the reasons we're in a difficult period is we don't have leadership in too many places. You have leadership in the UAE. I admire your leadership. I think your leadership is strong and it has a mission and it understands where it's going. But it's a small country and it doesn't obviously have the same impact as a country that's a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, and so forth. I love my country. I consider myself a patriot. I think true patriotism doesn't have to always agree with everything that a government is doing, which is different from your country. The history of the United States, I think, is a brilliant history. I really believe that. But we've made mistakes, like lots of countries. Everybody makes mistakes. But when you think about it, think about the evolution of humankind. We're in the year 2019. The first 1,000 years of recorded history were pretty rough when you think about it. All the way through the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages. And it wasn't really until the 1600s and 1700s, 1800s, that the theory of human rights, the rights of man, France and the Revolution and the Enlightenment and the Renaissance and all of this period of time, that people began to think differently about their relationship to governance. And there's different theories about it. I'm not here to sell one theory over another, even though I'm a Democrat, little d, and I believe in democracy. But people have to choose how they want to live. But the fact is, the world, the planet, has made remarkable progress through till the 21st century. Think about it. We are curing diseases we never thought we'd cure. It's polio, smallpox, tuberculosis, malaria. Nowadays, you can get individualized cancer treatment because of the genome project and what we know about the human body. If you're a woman in the world today and you're pregnant and you give birth to a child, you are 50% more likely to live through childbirth, and your child is 50% more likely to be fed and go to school and live. There is less people, even though Sri Lanka happened the other day, even though we saw ISIS, Al-Qaeda, despite the violence we see on television sometimes, the truth is far, far fewer people are dying in this century than ever died in human history. Go back to the 20th century, just last century. World War I, World War II, end of the Ottoman Empire, end of the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the hydrogen bomb, think about it, millions of people dying. 30 million people in Russia alone in World War II defending against fascism in history. So here we are, we have far less state-on-state violence. What we do have today is more non-state actor violence. That's our challenge. We're here at a book fair. There's knowledge in every one of these books out here. More people have to be able to get that knowledge. More people have to be able to read. More people need to go to school. That's still a challenge. But on the road of progress today, think about it. Look at Abu Dhabi. I mean, I went up to the top of the Burj Khalifa with Sheikh Abdullah when I was here a number of years ago as secretary. And he explained to me how this was sand and that was sand. Everywhere there was sand. And how as a child he used to have to push his father's car to get it out of the sand when it got stuck. Think of the roads you have, the infrastructure you built, the museum. I just went to the Louvre Museum. You're building another national museum, another Guggenheim Museum. It's extraordinary what is happening here. So you can't look at things just as now. You have to have a sense of the continuance of history. And I think, when you think about it, we're making progress. There are times when it looks dark and horrible. But I'm an optimist about where we're going because most of the problems we face are human-induced, including climate change. And we can change it. We just need the kind of leadership we had that won World War II, when people got together and said, we're going to win, and we're going to do everything we have to win. We're not doing that now, folks. I don't see that happening on climate change. I negotiated the Paris agreements for the United States. We said we're going to keep the Earth's temperature at 2 degrees centigrade. We said we'll try to keep it at 1.5. Now the scientists are telling us that in the next 10 years, if we don't stop the next 0.5 degrees of rise, we're going to have catastrophes on the Earth. Are we doing it? No. We're not. So we could do it. Why do I say we could do it? Because the solution to climate change is energy policy. We're going to be using gas and oil, which are critical to this region, for a long, long time. But we can do it smarter. We can do it with more solar, with more wind, with more hydro. We can maybe have hydrogen fuel. Maybe we're going to have battery storage that's significantly better so that we can have more solar. Those are the discoveries of the future, and that's what we need to be reaching for. But we're not sufficiently. So when you say, you know, dark period, hard period, we'll fight through this. But we need more and more people who are prepared to demand accountability from leadership. I testified to the Congress the other day, last week, and I had a member of Congress ask me some of the dumbest questions I've ever heard in my life. And he's a denier, doesn't believe that climate change is really happening, even though there isn't one legitimate, really peer-reviewed study in the world that negates human impact on what's happening with climate change. And there are thousands of reports that do. So this is a moment where we need to demand more discipline from each other, and we need to work at this. Now, here's what else is happening. The United States of America led the effort to create the post-World War II order. There were only about 5 or 10 democracies back then. Fascism and communism had gained some currency during the 1930s and the 40s because of the failure of capitalism, because it was robber baron capitalism, not a thoughtful capitalism. And it failed. Then came World War II. World War II is the machinery that brought the United States out of depression. And after World War II, we created a global structure for international financial institutions, for the United Nations, for the World Health Organization, for the human rights structure. All of that structure is what has guided us and made life better for the last 75 years. But now you have disruptors and disruption purposefully trying to pull things apart. Steve Bannon is working in Brussels, he's working in Rome, he's working in Spain, trying to encourage the people who want to pull things apart, anarchists, people who don't believe in the structure. President Putin and President Xi are actively going around the world talking about how the liberal order of the West is dead and the United States of America is in decline. Read the speeches. That's the challenge of today. And it is critical for us to be smarter, to push back against disruption, and to point out to people that yes, the United States may have made a mistake in Iraq or a mistake here or there, but I got news for you folks. No country in all of human history has won as many big wars of consequence, conquered as much territory as we have, and turned around and given it back. After World War II, we gave the Marshall Plan to Germany and to Japan. We didn't lord it over people. We helped them rebuild their constitutions and rebuild their societies. And now Germany and Japan are two of the strongest economies and strongest democracies in the world. So what I'm saying to you is the choices you make matter. The truth matters. Making sure that you have facts and you're dealing with facts matter. We've had a country attacking our democracy for the last 5 years or more, and they're going to try and attack it again. What's their vision of the future? What are they offering the world? Well, look at their economy. The economy of Russia ranks behind Italy, behind Spain, behind most of Europe, of strong countries. So this is a critical moment where we need to work together, come back together, recognize that if you didn't have a United Nations, you'd have to invent the United Nations. And if we don't work together to solve these problems together, no one nation will do well, and no one nation will survive what's coming at us if we begin to see things pull apart. And so it's a very, very critical moment on this planet of ours, and we all need to work together to find the solutions.
John, we're beginning. How much time do we have? Just 2 minutes. And we have 100 themes to raise with you, John, including your work at the State Department for the resolution of the Palestinian question. Very quickly, how close were you to clinching a deal, and why?
We were very, very close. If the leaders had wanted to make peace, we had the peace. We dealt with the security of Israel. We dealt with the integrity of a viable, contiguous state for the Palestinians. We dealt with the long-term security needs of Israel. We solved the challenge. In fact, many people don't know this, but we changed the Arab Peace Initiative, which was put together by King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia and offered up, which talked about a regional security plan. So we built out the possibility of a regional security plan where every country in the region would have been part of defending the future for each other. And we offered a vision where the Arab world accepted the idea of Israel as a Jewish state. That was enshrined in the principles of the Paris conference before I left being secretary. And we had a solution for the problem of refugees that would have maintained the integrity of what Israel's trying to create, but also respected Palestinian rights and future. So I think we had frankly, a terrific solution. The problem is neither leader was in a position. It's not one blame. It's both leaders were not in a position to do what they had to do politically to make it happen. And it's a great lesson in the concept of ripeness. Like fruit is ripe. When your fruit is ripe, mango, it's great. If it's not ripe, can't do it. Same thing with diplomacy. If it's not ripe, sometimes the mediators simply can't force a round peg through a square hole. And that's where we wound up. But you have to think about what will make peace in the long run. Can you have a greater Arab or non-Jewish population between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River Valley than there are Jews and have a democracy? I doubt it. So what will you have? Will you have equal citizenship? Will everybody be able to vote? There are big questions that continue to hang out over the future of the Middle East. And I'm not going to sit here and go through them all now. I'm not going to comment on the current efforts. I think that'd be inappropriate. I simply ask you to read for yourselves and make a judgment about the fundamental issues that have always divided this region over Jerusalem, over the three great religions, the Abrahamic religions, and the role they play in this region. This region could be the richest region in the world, beyond the richness it has today from what comes out of the earth, because the three great religions all have their major sites here. Think, if you made peace, of what you could have for tourism, for the learning of the rest of the world. You could have the great financial center, the great trade-offs of agriculture between Israel and the other countries, if there was a sharing of a vision of the future. My hope and prayer is still for that. I believe in it.
John, very quickly also, one of the reviews said readers of this book, whatever their political persuasion, will come away grateful that we have public servants who are prepared to spend their lives in service to their country. We have with us here our students of the Diplomatic Academy. What quick advice could you give them so that they can dedicate themselves like you did to public service, and how could they use diplomacy to achieve our goals?
Listen to Bernardino Leon. Best advice. Diplomacy is really humanity and common sense at its best aspirations. And just keep your eye on people and what people want, and you'll be a great diplomat, I promise you. And thank you for wanting to be involved in that as a future. There's nothing more rewarding than being able to help work for peace, work for your country, work to bring people together. And by the way, again, I just want to say Abu Dhabi is a miracle in terms of what it's doing right now in all of that. You're very lucky. And I think it's a great example to the world of how we transform things over time. So I wish you well in all of that. And hopefully our politics will work out. You know, I'm not going to say anything about Donald Trump. I'm not going to say anything that Rex Tillerson hasn't already said anyway. But I just say to all of you, the choices we face right now are all manageable. They really are. And you just keep that sense of optimism about what we can do. Technology is changing the world. We're living longer than we ever lived before. We live better, even though we have people who don't have electricity. But when I was in college, the severe poverty rate of the world was 50% plus. Today, the severe poverty rate is under 10%. 450 million Chinese have come into middle class or aspiring middle class. Almost as many Indians. What's happening in the world today, incidentally, if I can take a minute, what's exciting is the very thing the United States wanted to have happen after World War II has happened. We wanted countries to adopt market economy. And we wanted countries to grow. And we helped Japan and Germany to grow. Well, what's happened today? Hundreds of countries have grown. Well, we have 206 or so countries, but everybody's grown. And in the process, more and more people are educated. More and more people know what other people are doing in the world. More and more people are traveling. So I'm very encouraged because when we had about 15 democracies at one point leading up to World War II, today there are 88 democracies in the world, according to the Freedom House measurement. There are 59 countries that are deemed to be mostly free. Not full democracy, but mostly free. There are 44 countries where people are not free. Think about that. To me, that's the march of history. And I am confident that if we apply ourselves, we listen to other people, we can solve the problems that we face in the world. And you young folks, your future, you're the ones who are going to do this. And every generation where we've advanced, we advance because young people have a vision and they put their energy into helping to make it a reality. So I hope you'll all do that. And maybe you'll read my book and you get a few ideas.
So, John, my absolute final questions. You write at the end of the book, my hope is that as you finish reading these pages, and I hope everybody will read that book, you will believe more in the possibilities and less in the hurdles, and that more of you will dare to try more. Do we expect, at the $30 million question, a presidential candidate, Senator Kerry or Secretary of State Kerry, in the next elections?
You want me to make news here, huh? Not at the moment, no. I've looked at it and I've analyzed it and thought about it. I haven't written anything off, but my friend Joe Biden, I hope, is going to announce and get in the race in the next days, and we'll see what happens. But I've never said never to almost anything on earth, but it's not what I'm doing right now. Right now I'm focused actually on climate change. Dr. Ernie Moniz, who was our Secretary of Energy, and I are working on a new proposal. I'm not going to talk about it here today, but we think there are things the world can do to move faster and to energize itself on this subject. We're going to make some thoughts about that known in the next weeks, and that's where my energy is going right now.
Thank you very much, John. This was really very, very insightful. We thank you for giving us so much time.
Great to be with you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you very much, everybody.
His Highness Sheikh Saif bin Zayed.
What?
His Sheikh Saif bin Zayed, Minister and Minister of